Hello, and thanks for listening in as we take another look into the Psalms. I'm going to be in Psalm 92, Psalm of Worship, of course, as many of the Psalms are. According to John 4:23, God is seeking people who worship Him in spirit and in truth. True worship means worshiping God in spirit, that is, our inner being, must be in right relationship with God, so that the outer motions of worship flow from the inside out. God doesn't want us just to go through the motions, but to have hearts that overflow with love for Him. But also, we are to worship God in truth. Worship must have content. It must be based on the true revelation God has given of Himself in His Word. And so for that reason, you cannot properly worship until you understand something of who God is and what He has done. The Bible is clear that God is seeking worshipers. We cannot be His children without seeking to grow as true worshipers of God. And Psalm 92 is a psalm of heartfelt worship. There are no petitions for help or cries for deliverance. The author simply focuses on the Lord and His great blessings and overflows in worship. And so from this psalm, we can identify certain things regarding worship that is from the heart. I'm going to begin, first of all, with the expressions of heartfelt worship. Verses 1 through 3, again, we're in Psalm 92. It is a good thing to give thanks unto the Lord, and to sing praises unto Thy name, O Most High, to show forth Thy loving kindness in the morning, and Thy faithfulness every night. Upon an instrument of 10 strings, and upon the psaltery, upon the harp, with a solemn sound. Now, the superscription of Psalm 92 does not identify the author, but it does provide a comment about the use of the psalm. It says that this is a psalm for the Sabbath day. This suggests that this psalm focuses on the area of worship, in particular, the public worship of God's people. And these first 3 verses offer 3 ways in which God's people can express their worship. First of all, we express worship by giving thanks. That's verse 1. It's a good thing to give thanks unto the Lord. This is an acknowledging of God for who He is and for what He has done. So we need to live with an ongoing awareness that God has blessed our lives far beyond what we deserve. And the psalmist tells us it is good to give thanks. That is, it is appropriate in light of who He is and all that He does and who we are and what we deserve. It is appropriate that we give God thanks as an expression of heartfelt worship. Second, we note that we express worship by singing praises. Verse 1 goes on, and to sing praises unto Thy name, O Most High. Worship ought at times be vocal. Now keep in mind, this was a psalm for the Sabbath day. The psalmist is referring specifically to the gathering of God's people. God's people, certainly more so than any other people on the face of this earth, should express worship by the singing of praises. As we gather together, we express our worship through song. And then third, we express worship by declaring God's goodness. And that's verse 2. The psalmist tells us here to show forth. That has the idea of to make known. Others need to hear of His goodness. The psalmist identifies in particular 2 aspects of His goodness. He is a God of loving kindness and faithfulness. So would a person who doesn't know God be able to look at your life and tell whether you have been blessed by God? In other words, is your life an ongoing expression of heartfelt worship? Worshiping God in the morning, every night, because He is a God who is good, who is worthy of our praise. And so we see the expressions of heartfelt worship. We'll note second, the basis of heartfelt worship. Looking at verses 4 and 5, O Thou Lord hast made me glad through Thy work. I will triumph in the works of thy hands. O Lord, how great are thy works, and thy thoughts are very deep. The psalmist shows us that the basis for our worship is the works of God. He is reflecting on what God has done for him and for the nation of Israel in the past. And he is able to point to those occasions where God's loving kindness and his faithfulness have been put on display in his experience. Now, this is worship that is grounded in truth. There is an expression of our emotions, as seen in verse 1, but worship is not merely an emotional experience. It is rooted in the knowledge of who God is and what he does. I want to point out, by way of contrast, a few verses from Psalm 95. Reading verses 6 through 11. O come, let us kneel and bow down. Let us kneel before the God our Maker. For he is our God, we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart, as in the provocation, and as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways, unto whom I swear in my wrath, that they should not enter into my rest. Now, God led Israel into the wilderness experience in order to show them his works, as it says there in Psalm 95 in verse 9. God led them even into adversity in the wilderness experience, doing so in order to provide for their needs. In that way, they would see him at work. And never, not once, did God fail to provide for his people. And so he purposed these times of need so that he could prove himself to be faithful to his promises. So God led Israel into adversity in order to do them good. But how did the people respond to these things? Well, they saw every instance of adversity as evil. Numbers 20, verse 5, as an example. They refer to the wilderness as this evil place. Now, God desires his works to be an occasion for worship. All that he does in our lives is an expression of his loving kindness and his faithfulness. And even in adversity, God is at work. Well, like Israel, we can harden our hearts to what God is doing. And so instead of responding with worship, we respond with complaining and murmuring. And so we need to see and understand, have faith in knowing that God is at work in all of our experiences, those that we might consider good and those that we might consider bad. The works of God form a basis for our worship if we believe and are confident that God is always at work for our good, as he promises he is. All right, so we see the expressions of heartfelt worship. We see the basis of heartfelt worship, the works of God. And then last, we'll notice the motivation for heartfelt worship. And that takes us from verse 4 through the end of this psalm, verse 15. In the first line of verse 4, the psalmist tells us his motivation. He says there, "For thou, O Lord, hast made me glad." The worship of the psalmist is an overflow of the joy and gladness that God has given him. To the psalmist, worship is not a drudgery, it is a delight. And then verses 5 through 15 expand on verse 4 by describing God's work, which motivates the psalmist to worship him joyfully. Specifically, the work of God has to do with the punishment of the wicked and the exaltation of the righteous. So let's note that. First of all, we see here we are motivated to worship God because of his certain victory over the wicked. Verses 6 through 9. "A brutish man knoweth not, neither doth a fool understand this. When the wicked spring up as the grass, and when all the workers of iniquity do flourish, it is that they shall be destroyed forever. But thou, Lord, art most high forevermore." the psalmist here expresses the same kind of worship that we see occurring in the book of Revelation. I won't turn to that passage, but if you were to look at chapter 16, verses 5 through 7, you would see very much the same thing here, that there is worship of God because of his victory over the wicked. We worship God because it is a demonstration of his holiness and his righteous judgments. God punishes the wicked because they refuse to bow down before him. And in so doing, his justice is seen. So we are motivated to worship God because of his certain victory over the wicked. But also we see here that we are motivated to worship God because of his certain loyalty to the righteous. And that's verses 10 through 15. We notice here that there is the certainty that God will exalt the righteous. Verses 10 and 11, but my horn shalt thou exalt like the horn of a wild ox. I shall be anointed with fresh oil. Mine eye also shall see my desire on my enemies. Mine ear shall hear my desire of the wicked that rise up against me. We notice here that not only is it God's purpose to destroy the wicked, but it is God's purpose to exalt the righteous. Just as God triumphs over his enemies, those who trust in God are made to triumph over their enemies. And then second, we note there is the certainty that God establishes the righteous. And that's verses 12 through 15. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those that be planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bring forth fruit in old age. They shall be fat and flourishing, to show that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. There's a certainty here that God establishes the righteous. The word flourish occurs in verse 7, and then again in verses 12 and 13, in order to highlight the contrast that's intended here. The wicked quickly flourish for a time, but they also quickly perish like grass. The righteous, on the other hand, flourish like trees, not grass. They may not prosper as rapidly, but their prosperity is permanent. And then verse 15 closes out this psalm by proclaiming God's purpose for preserving the righteous. God exalts us and establishes us so that we may be able to proclaim that he is upright. God blesses us not primarily for our own benefit, but so that he might receive the honor and worship that is due him. And so worship is an intelligent response to God, in contrast to the senseless man who does not recognize or respond to God's goodness. God has flooded your life and my life with his love and his faithfulness and his goodness. And he wants you to be filled with heartfelt worship for all his wonderful works.